First off, I'd like to say thanks for coming on here, Lydia, because I really appreciate you coming on and sharing. Like, this is something that people don't talk about, people don't share. So I'd like to hear from the beginning. How did you get into this? How did you get into midwifery? Were you just a CPM? Like, I'd like to hear from like the beginning of, so people get a backstory of how you started, how you got into this.
Sure. Well, when I was pregnant with my first child, I was invited to come to a meeting about doulas. I was invited because I went to La Leche League, and here I was thinking in terms of I'd always heard breastfeeding was the best way to feed a baby, so I went to La Leche League and they invited me to this thing. And at first, I wasn't interested at all. I was like, I'm getting an epidural. I am not interested in whatever they're doing. But I went to the meeting and there was such a feeling of community there. And I felt valued as a pregnant woman. And I was in a place in my life where I didn't have a lot of friends. I was living in the small town where my husband grew up. And if any of you ever lived in a small town that you're not from, you probably know what I'm talking about. It can be pretty lonely. And so I kind of think of it in terms of almost being love bombed, that these people were like a community that I could step into and feel like I was a part of. And so, and then I watched a video where it kind of showed a woman in labor and it wasn't that bad. And people were saying, yeah, like some labors just aren't that bad. And I thought to myself, well, why don't I hire one of these doulas and see how it goes? And maybe I'll get lucky and it just won't be that bad. And if not, I'll just get an epidural, no big deal. And so I ended up hiring two doulas who, one of them had never been to a birth before. So that's why I got two. The other one had been to 5 births, which in my book made her quite the expert. And so I had my first baby. I had a 6-hour labor. It was not easy. It was very intense and painful. However, I mean, now that I've seen hundreds of labors, I know that on the grand scheme of things, it went well. It went very easily. And I felt like, oh my gosh, I have figured out this wonderful thing. All you have to do is be like me and hire a couple of doulas, and you can have this natural birth and brag to everybody who will listen about how you didn't need an epidural. And so when my daughter was a couple months old, I thought, and I heard about this doula workshop, and I thought, I could do that. I could help women have these marvelous birth experiences. They don't need to have C-sections. They could do what I did. That's really what I was thinking. And here, I mean, I was 22 years old. I was susceptible to kind of just this I've found the answer to life kind of attitude, I guess. So I went to the doula workshop. I did all my stuff to become a doula. And I guess it was a couple years later when it somehow, I guess I was reading more stuff about birth and everything. And I had attended a couple births by that point. And I thought to myself, what if I could become a midwife? And at first it seemed like, oh, you can't do that. Being a midwife is like being a magical fairy person, and you're not magical. But then I kind of researched a little bit more and I was like, well, this is actually like a career path. Like people can do this. And I researched different midwifery schools. When I say researched, I Googled and I found different midwifery schools. And I found one that I could get into with no college degree. And since I didn't have a college degree, that seemed like, okay, this is great. I don't want to have to go to school for 8 years to do something. I want to be able to just go do it. And here's a place where you could be attending births from day one. So my whole family picked up and moved down to Florida, and I attended the International School of Midwifery, which is located in, well, I'm not sure if it still is, to be perfectly honest with you. I think it is, but at the time it was located on the campus of the Miami Maternity Center, a birth center with a pretty high volume, 3 birth rooms and a prenatal clinic. And the head midwife lived on site. So she had her own little house on the same campus as the birth center and the prenatal clinic. And I was actually pregnant at the time. And I was about 8 months pregnant when I started there. And I had my baby there. And predictably, since I had an easy first birth, I also had a fairly easy second birth. I had only attended prenatals before I gave birth. So I didn't really know how birth went in that birth center before I gave birth myself there. And it was weird to me because my birth went very smoothly. And afterward, like several of the students were just telling me, your birth was the most beautiful one I've ever seen. And I'm like, why? And I learned why, because that birth center employs some incredibly brutal tactics. They do a lot of things that are unethical, illegal, painful, risky on a regular basis. And by the time I started to catch on to that, you know, like the very first birth that I attended there, I had my baby in a sling and I attended this birth, and they used, she was having a hard time pushing her baby out, and they used a vacuum to pull the baby out. The very first one I attended. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, how great that we can do this and save her from a C-section. And later I found out when I was talking to other students, I'm like, oh yeah, they used the vacuum. And the other students, they were older than I was, kind of looked at me like, don't say that. And I'm like, why? They're like, we call it the fruit. I was like, because it's illegal? And they were like, yeah. And I was like, oh, I did not know that it was illegal. And I was kind of floored, but here I am. I've moved my whole family to Florida. We're doing this thing. And so I justified it. And I said, well, it must not be illegal for a very good reason. It must be that we're breaking this law to help people and it's the right thing to do. So, you know, I thought of it in terms of civil disobedience, I guess. And I didn't think that the babies could get hurt from it. I knew that I started to realize we did it all the time. We did it a lot. And I saw us do a lot of things that everything seemed to turn out okay. So I started to trust that whatever we were doing must be okay, because things were turning out okay. And we had a very low transport rate. And I felt like, in a way, I was learning from the best. Someone who could get a 5% transport or rate or lower, she must be really good at what she does. So I thought I was learning from the best. However, I also thought, when I get out of here, I'm going to do things a little bit differently. I'm going to be more gentle. I'm going to be less, I'm not going to do as many interventions as she does. I'm going to let nature take its course more, and people are going to have a better experience. So when I graduated, that's kind of what I set out to do, is like figure out how to use what I'd learned to practice effectively, and then also do it in a way that made me feel better about it, because a lot of the births I witnessed at the birth center in Miami were pretty brutal, pretty harsh. So that's kind of how I got started. I hope I answered your question.
How long do you think it took? Because did you end up going off and becoming a CPM, or did you, because you were doing doula and then you went off to midwifery, what did you end up, did you actually just be a CPM?
So what I did first was I became a licensed midwife in the state of South Carolina. So I didn't necessarily need to become a certified professional midwife in order to practice as a licensed midwife. So I got my license in South Carolina based on my experience in Florida, and I attended over 50 births in Florida. I think I attended about 125, but I was acting as the baby catcher, kind of as the primary midwife under supervision for 50 of those births. So that gave me plenty to become a licensed midwife. And then a couple years later is when I decided that I needed more alphabet soup behind my name. And I went ahead and applied for my CPM credential. So then I could be Lee Franson, LM CPM. and look
Mm.
really extra professional because of all those letters. So,
Oh yeah, those letters are very tricky. I know because we didn't know the difference, and we do now. We do now know what they all mean, but we didn't know back then. So
no, you just see a whole bunch of letters and you think, wow, that person must be highly trained. I'm guilty of the same thing. So I understand.
that's very true. So, so during that time, since you only seen about, since you were like baby catching for only like 50, how much time do you think that was? How many months or years do you think that was?
Well, I attended the school in Miami for 3 years. And
Yeah.
so, right off the bat, I started out with getting what were called observes. So, you have to observe like 25 births, and then you have to assist with 25. And so, I would start out observing, and then I would slowly kind of work my way into being the baby catcher. So, that obviously was kind of like I think by my second year is when I started catching. And then they would kind of just slowly kind of pull back and not guide you as much. So, like for your very first birth, your hands are down there, but you've got somebody else whose hands are also right there, and they're helping with every single thing that you're doing. And then by the end, they're just watching and then giving you a critique afterward if necessary.
Hmm.
So it took almost the full 3 years for me to get my numbers, which is how we referred to it. It included 5 continuity of cares, which basically meant that I had to see this woman starting as early as possible in her pregnancy for all of her prenatal care for the birth and for her postpartum care. And because with the continuities, you develop a closer relationship with those than the ones where you just show up and do their birth. And so there was one of them in particular that I remember, and I felt like she was mine. And because I felt that way about her, it really bothered me when the head midwife slipped her some Cytotec into her vagina and told her that it was evening primrose oil. And I mean, I knew that this was happening, but this was happening to my client, like this was someone that trusted me. And so when Sherry said, oh, I'm going to give you some evening primrose to get things going. And I said, oh, okay. And I grabbed the evening primrose and I was going to give it to her. And she was like, oh, no, I want to get the more powerful evening primrose. And I was like, okay. And I'm thinking, okay, these are like 500s or whatever. Maybe she's going to go get the thousands. Like, okay. But when she came back, I saw that there was crushed white powder on her fingertips. And I knew what that was. I knew it was an evening primrose oil in a capsule. So I really had a hard time with that one because it's like she was not told that she was getting this medicine. It's not legal for her to get that medicine for that purpose. It's legal for us to use it to stop a hemorrhage, but it's not legal to induce labor that way. And I just felt like I had betrayed her trust by keeping silent in that moment. But also, I was weeks from graduation. And I knew that if I said anything, I'd get just kicked out. I'd have nothing to show for the last 3 years. And probably nothing was going to happen because nothing ever did happen. She got to do whatever she wanted to do. And everybody just went along with it. And every student who ever left, which there were quite a few who left for one reason or another, like they would try to report her and nothing would ever happen to her. And she was just Teflon. And then I would see that they just kind of disappeared. The students, like we just didn't hear from them anymore. They just weren't important anymore. They weren't getting to do what we were getting to do. So I just couldn't see myself standing up and saying, hey, don't give her that. She didn't agree. At the time I just was quiet and said, well, I'm not the one doing it. And I wouldn't do that to someone. So I'm going to have to be okay with this.
And so was she like your mentor? Did you have like a certain trainer that went through from like you're getting educated and all that stuff? Like, did you have one person or did you have a certain like, I don't know, curriculum? Like, how did it work of your training?
Yeah. I mean, we had to meet as a state licensed school in the state of Florida. They had to meet a certain curriculum thing to be accredited. So we took classes. I mean, I remember my first set of classes was like phlebotomy. So like they could put me to work right away, taking blood and giving shots and things like that. Nursing skills so that they could make me, you know, like right off the bat, I'm taking people's blood pressures and pulse and respirations and things like that. And then as time went on, we would take classes in like, say, embryology. And there was a set curriculum for all of them. And I mean, it's set up to look like a completely, I mean, it's state accredited. So you feel like it's very legit. We took tests, we took quizzes, we handed in papers. It was like a normal school, and we got credit for our classes. So as we moved through, now as far as the actual hands-on training, we had about 4 or 5 midwives on staff. So there was the head midwife, Sherry, and then there were the rest of the midwives. One of them was a CNM, and I learned a lot from directly under her. And but you know, she was part of the whole system there. Like she didn't do anything different just because she had a different credential. So that also kind of lent credence to what the other midwives were doing, because, you know, here we have a CNM, which everyone knew that CNM was kind of like a ooh credential. Like, you know, we always thought that she's extra special. She gets to write prescriptions and insert IUDs and things like that. So, you know, we definitely kind of had a little extra respect for her, but we also had a little feeling of, but I get to do all the fun stuff and I don't have to go to all that school and pay back all those student loans. So who's really smart? You know, like there was a certain amount of that too.
I just had a question. After you noticed her administering a medication without informed consent, did you guys dialogue about it afterwards? Absolutely not.
We saw her do things under the table all the time. And if I had challenged her on that, I mean, I had seen what had happened to other students who challenged her. They were kicked out. And these credits are not transferable. So it's not like you can say, well, then I'm going to go to this other midwifery school and finish up. You lost everything. All the money you had paid, all the credits you had earned, everything was just it was dust. It was worth nothing. And so by the time that I really saw what she was doing, by the time I had a continuity of care, I was so close to graduation, the idea of throwing all of that away to stand up to her, and for what? You know, I had never seen her have a single consequence. I had never, you know, people had told her before, you shouldn't do this. This is wrong. And she would just be like, if you don't like it, you can leave. So no, we didn't dialogue about it at all. I had to just swallow that feeling that I had, that feeling of guilt and betrayal of the client. I had to just swallow that and live with it.
Now in your state, because I know you did stuff down in Florida and then you moved, you know, up a little bit more north, but were those type of things illegal there, or are they legal down in Florida?
So the things that I know were illegal for sure would be administering a side attack while a person's still pregnant. You can do it once they've given birth, because then it's to control a hemorrhage, and that's okay, but you're not supposed to give it during birth. Administering Pitocin during the labor process, that we did all the time. And I didn't know that until really late in the game. We thought we were just giving a whole lot of IVs for hydration. And the reason was given that, you know, because, you know, women like being hydrated. It feels good to be hydrated and not to have to drink so much in labor. And if they drink, they'll just vomit. So let's just give them a nice IV for hydration. Well, that was the cover for the fact that she was actually putting Pitocin into the bags without anybody knowing it. No one charted it. I don't know what the dosage was. And wow. So, yeah, if we had to transport, she would change the bag real quick to just fluids so that nobody would suspect that it was Pitocin that she had spiked it with. So that's illegal. Using the vacuum to pull a baby out is illegal. And then there were a lot of things that weren't necessarily illegal, but we used a lot of fundal pressure. And what fundal pressure means is pushing on the pregnant woman's abdomen, pushing down on that baby to try to get them to come out. And it's not safe. It can apparently, and this is like something I don't feel super qualified to explain exactly why it's not safe, but I do know that it's used a lot in low resource environments, and that it can lead to things like cerebral palsy and other physical damage to a baby. You can imagine ramming a baby through a bony pelvis. You would never dream of doing that to a newborn in your arms. I'm just going to ram it through this hard hole. You would never. But because it's still in the abdomen, we would, and I've seen them use fundal pressure in hospitals under different circumstances, like trying to move a baby down a little bit during a C-section, for example. It's very common. But we were pushing very hard. And there were times when, as students, she would always tell us, like, push harder, push harder. And we would brace ourselves with our feet on the wall, pushing on this woman's abdomen to try to get this baby down and out. And I don't think there's necessarily a law against that. But it's not right. It's definitely not standard of care. It's something that probably no one thought to make a law about, because it's just shouldn't be happening. And it's not something anybody would think. It's not something your legislators would just dream up sitting around one day, like, what should they not be doing? So I don't think it's against the law. And there were a lot of things like that where it's not illegal, but it's not right.
Makes sense. When you went off to do your own practice and did your own thing and to catch babies on your own, what do you think like the average birth would look like? What did it look like to you? I'm just curious.
Well, it would really depend on whether it was your first baby or not. So we had kind of two categories of people. First timers. These are people who, for whatever reason, they are already kind of interested in having this natural birth, even though they haven't experienced a birth before. And a lot of times I would think these kind of are almost like your people who have grown up with these ideas. Maybe they've been exposed to it from a young age. Maybe their mother had home births. And so, that's what they want. And then there would be the second timers. These are people that had their first baby in the hospital, didn't like it very much, and now they want something very different for their second. So I'll talk about the second timers first, because they're a little bit easier to talk about. Second timers, now I was not doing VBACs, and that's actually a complicated topic, because we were doing VBACs in Florida. In Florida, it is legal for a midwife to attend your VBAC at home. It is not legal for her to attend it in a birth center. And the reason for that is because it was two different committees that made up the rules for home birth and birth center birth at different times. So it makes no logical sense, but that's the case. However, there is this little loophole where it said if they're participating in a study, then they can do it at the birth center. So we kind of had this bogus study that wasn't real. And we would say, we're doing VBACs here. And then in the paperwork, we'd put something about how, they're participating in a study. So that's how we got away with that for like years. But in South Carolina, I was not allowed to do VBACs at all. So I wasn't doing any second timers who had not previously given birth vaginally. So because of that, second time vaginal birthers are pretty famous for being very easy. 99 times out of 100, that's a made up statistic. Don't take that to the bank. The vast majority of the time, second vaginal birth babies just kind of fall right out. They are what we call in the business butter births. I don't know exactly where that came from, if it's because butter is slippery, or if it's because the idea of just having something kind of luxurious, like, I'm going to make $2,000 for holding my hands like this, and here you go, here's your baby. It was very easy work. Their labors are usually short. They don't push for very long, and the babies are usually absolutely fine. So those were the easy ones. Those were the ones I really wanted, to be honest with you, because it was just very easy work, and I didn't have to worry very much. And then the first timers were a different story. The first timers would oftentimes have longer labors. And I did end up doing a lot of transports, which at the time really bothered me. Like I felt like I wasn't a very good midwife because I had to transport so many people. I did have a lot of compassion for women who were suffering in labor for a long, long time because both of my labors were only 6 hours long. So when I was, helping someone who'd been in hard labor for 18 hours, my heart always went right out to her. And I was always like, dang, I don't know if this was me, if I would even keep doing this, And so the moment she would be like, maybe I don't think I could do this anymore, I was the midwife who might be like, you don't have to. We could go if you want, So it was a little bit of an internal struggle because I'm like, I felt bad, like taking their money and then just take them to the hospital and not having to really do much of the hard work. And then they have to pay the hospital too. But I didn't feel so bad that I gave them their money back. And if I had, my name would have been absolute dirt in the midwifery community. They would never that was never an option. You never give refunds. It's just, yeah. If you think you're going to get a refund from your home birth midwife, think again. Yeah. And at the time I justified it by saying, well, if I give them their money back, if I take them to the hospital, then I'll always not want to take them because I want to keep my money. Therefore, I have to keep all the money so that I don't give myself a reason not to take them in. That would make me an unsafe midwife. So that's kind of how I justified it. So, and it's true to some extent. It's open for criticism for sure. So yeah, how a birth would go would depend, I would say, more than anything about whether or not she'd had a previous birth or not. And the first timers were always a lot more work. So that was something that we definitely kept in mind. And every time I took on a first timer, I always thought, oh, this one could be a rough one. This one could take a long time. This one could be tough.
Did you do breech or twins?
So it's not legal to do multiples or any presentation other than Vertex in South Carolina. So I definitely could not knowingly take that on. With the case of twins, I did actually diagnose a case of twins once. So she was a client that I really liked a lot, and I was so excited to attend her birth. And then when she was 16 weeks pregnant, her uterus felt too big to me. And then I found 2 heartbeats, and then I sent her in, and she ended up having a hospital birth. The breech thing, sadly, so when breech becomes apparent is toward the end of a pregnancy. And so when you already have a relationship with this person, you know how badly they want this home birth experience or birth center experience, and then their baby just won't turn. It's kind of like, it's hard. It's sad. You don't want to tell this person that you've been building this relationship with and looking forward to this with, you can't do this. So I remember in one case in particular, we turned a baby. We shouldn't have done that. That was dangerous because when we had turned the baby, if the baby had, for example, gotten choked on their cord, which can happen when you're flipping a baby manually, we would have had no way to get that baby out quickly. It would have been a disaster. But we did because we felt like this woman wants this birth so badly, let's try it. And it worked in that case. There was another case where we tried everything. We sent her for many expensive chiropractic appointments and to all these different practitioners of different modalities to see if they could get her baby to turn, and they couldn't. So we attempted a home birth. I attended as the doula because I legally couldn't be her midwife, but we found an underground midwife who was willing to take on a breech baby. Mm-hmm. Thank goodness that woman developed a little bit of a fever in labor, and the midwife said, let's go to the hospital. So she ended up having a C-section. Everything was fine. After that happened, I was either months or maybe years later, that midwife came to me and said, if that happened today, I know we would have been able to get that baby out. And I was like, oh, I'm really glad that didn't happen today. Mm-hmm. because she had a very uneventful C-section. I remember when I stopped to see her in the hospital after the C-section, she was just walking around like nothing had happened. I mean, she recovered so well. And I always wondered if she wondered, why did we try the home birth, or if she regretted that she went in. I don't know how she feels about it.
Since you transferred so many of your first timers, did any of them have a vaginal birth in the hospital and then return to you for a second birth?
Oh, good question. Yes. Yes. So first of all, your first question, did any of them have a vaginal birth in the hospital? Most of them did. My experience was not that we would transport and they would immediately go to C-section. They treated them like any other woman in labor. They evaluated and they went for vaginal birth. And if that wasn't working for some reason, then they would eventually make the decision for C-section. But most of my transports, they would get an epidural, they would take a nap. I would go home for a little bit, get some sleep. They'd call me and say, you know, hey, I'm ready to push. And I would head back to the hospital and they would have their baby and everything would be happy and great. Some of them, I would find out later, were angry with me that I didn't try more before we transported. Yeah, there's a couple that are coming to mind who, one of them like told everyone at La Leche League that I was the worst because I didn't try putting her in the tub before we decided to go to the hospital for pain management. And it's true. I didn't try everything with her. I could tell she needed to go. And I was just kind of like, why waste time? You need to go. And it wasn't for an emergency. It was just because she was in extreme pain very early on. And it just, I didn't
get any better.
It wasn't going to get better. It was only going to get worse for her. So, and then in terms of, did they come back to me for the next birth? That did happen a couple of times. More often, I never saw them again. Maybe because they moved away, maybe because they only had one child. And maybe because they had a really decent experience in the hospital and they were kind of like, you know what? I don't need to pay for my birth twice this time. I'm just going to go back to the hospital where I was treated pretty well. But yeah, there were a couple times when I transported and then she came back to me for baby number 2. And those always, well, no, one time that didn't go well. Yeah. Okay. So one of them had her first baby. She needed the vacuum in the hospital. And then for her second, she came back to me and I was expecting your typical second timer butter birth. No. She ended up with a C-section. And that was that was tough. But yeah, she loved me. I loved her. And we were really hoping that she would kind of have like a redemptive birth experience for her second.
C-section.
Well, it turned out, I mean, like it's very rare actually for a second baby to be born by C-section when the first one was vaginal, but in her case, it was just necessary. And yeah, but her babies are healthy. So, you know, happy about that. But yeah, that was I think the only time that I had a second timer end up with a C-section. And I very rarely even transported second timers.
I have a question about the mentality of justifying all the unethical and legal behavior. How did you rationalize that in your head as you were doing it to make it okay?
Yeah, so you must be referring to my time in Miami because that's really when that kind of stuff was going on.
Like, you know, when you knew exactly what you were doing was directly against the raw law, ethical, immoral, you know, the side attack, the breech birth, the twin births, things like that.
Yeah. So as a student midwife, I was in a subservient position. And I was exposed very gradually. So I found out about the vacuum early on. Everybody does because it's very hard to hide something like that. But like the side attack, I didn't realize that was going on for a long time. The Pitocin, I had no idea for the longest time until another student told me. What had happened was she had written somewhere in the notes she wrote, IV helped with progress. That's all she wrote. IV helped with progress. And the midwife chewed her out for writing that. She was like, you can write IV for hydration, but you do not write IV helped with progress. And when she told me about how she'd been chewed out for that, I was like, what's going on here? And I started to kind of put it together that she was spiking the IVs. And then there was a time when I walked in on her spiking an IV, and she was like, you know, it was like a child doing something they're not supposed to do. And then you walk into the room and they're like hiding it. That's how she acted when I walked in. And and that was toward the end. So a lot of the stuff I didn't really know that it was going on until I was so invested that it felt like it was too late to back out. And it felt like I would be throwing away a lot of work, effort, money, all of the above to just walk out. So the way I justified it was by saying, I'm not the one doing it. And I won't do it once I get out there on my own. Like, I am going to find a better way. So I think that I think all the students probably had things that they felt very similarly. They were like, this is wrong. But they also felt like trying to stand up against it would be fruitless, and it would only give them bad consequences, because nothing bad ever seemed to happen to the birth center or to the midwives who were perpetuating these things. Nothing bad ever happened to them. Even when they were turned in by ex-students, nothing ever stuck. So it felt like you would just be screwing yourself over if you tried to take a stand.
Well, they're established, you know what I mean? They're established in their title and their business and their stuff. And then you guys look like students that don't know anything, or maybe you're mad at your teacher. You know, I'm sure they went and they probably knew the board that people were complaining to. So they could just be like to their friend, like, oh, that one was just really, you know, crappy about this, or had this kind of attitude, or, you know, so I'm sure they had like excuses to get out of with people turning them in, unfortunately. And it's sad, and it's really sad, because you wish that if there was enough going in, like something should be done. But of course, just imagine if that's happening to one midwife there, how many are happening all over the place that people are turning in and nothing's being done.
Right.
You know?
I have a question about, well, let's stick with the 50 births that you did the primary on. Since apparently there were interventions happening left and right with these supposedly natural births, of your 50, how many do you think were basically intervention free for the most part? No cytotec, no Pitocin, no fundal pressure, no kiwi?
Well, I can't give you a real number, because I haven't actually gone through and analyzed that. But what I can tell you is that probably most of the second timers got an actual natural birth, and most of the first timers did not.
How long do you think you had your business practicing before you finally reached a point where you were like, I can't do this anymore? And what was the point that made you say, I'm done and I can't do this?
So it's a complicated, it's complicated. We opened the birth center in 2009, and I want to say it was 2012 when things came to a head. And I was really butting heads a lot with, especially one of the other midwives in particular, who she was famous for never calling the second midwife in time to attend the birth. So because we were a birth center, we had a rule, you had to have 2 midwives for every birth. So the primary midwife would be there for most of the labor. And then when things were getting toward the end, she would call the other midwife, hey, come on in, we're going to have a baby soon. Now, everybody understands that sometimes you screw that up, you call too late, and, you know, the second midwife shows up and the baby's already out. It's understandable. It happens. It happens in the hospital like that. You know, once in a while you have a nurse catch because nobody thought the baby was that close and the doctor wasn't there. But with this midwife, it was every single birth. She was always calling too late. So, and I was the one like standing up against her and being like, you can't do that. This is the rule. She was famous for having parking lot births. She would basically have people stay home for so long that by the time they got there, it would step out of the car and the baby would fall out and she would be in the parking lot and catch it. Which makes for a fun birth story, I guess, but not a fun experience in the moment for sure. And if any of those had ever gone sideways, it's like, here you are in the middle of a parking lot exposed for the whole world to see whatever's going on, and without any of the gear that you need to try to help this baby. So,
well, if you're trying to drudge up business, that's a really perfect advertisement to expectant parents to be like, birthing is so natural and so easy. Look how many of my patients don't even make it through the door.
Right.
I'm just there to catch your baby and you still pay me thousands of dollars.
You're so right, because we would kind of almost use that as a bragging point, even though behind closed doors, I was telling her, you've got to have people come in sooner, and then you have to call the second midwife in time. You need
complications are hashtags.
Yeah. So, she and I were butting heads so much. This one time I remember I had sent an email because I was giving a tour of the birth center and I walked into the bathroom and there was this bloody butt print on the toilet seat. And I was so angry, and I figured out that she was the last person who would use that room. And it's the midwife's job to clean the room after the client leaves. So it was definitely her job. And I had sent out an email saying, I was giving a tour and there was a huge bloody ass print on the toilet seat. You need to do better. Oh my gosh. And then I got raked across the coals for being mean, And so it was like, we were just constantly butting heads, and it was about issues like that, but also issues of safety. And so I had come to a point where I was like, I don't trust the people that I'm working with anymore. So, but I owned 25% of this birth center, and business was booming, and we were expanding, and we were, at this point, I think we had 5 birth rooms. So we had already outpaced Miami, who only had 3 birth rooms, and we needed more. So we had 5 birth rooms with these beautiful state-of-the-art tubs, this huge mortgage, all this stuff I had to worry about. And I was like, I don't trust these people. And so the way it went down is I identified a friend of mine who was very like-minded, who was like, you got to practice safely. You have to stay within the rules. We have to make sure that we're doing everything the right way so that we don't have these disasters. She and I would kind of read the things, the criticisms of home birth and midwifery. We would read them together, and we would talk about, how do we make sure that we're not like this, that we're not making these kinds of poor decisions. So she was on the same page as me. And I was like, you know what? I only feel good working with you to kind of back me up here, because I feel like I'm all alone with these 3 other midwives who I don't trust to make good decisions. So I tried to incorporate her into the practice and bring her on. And they basically said, absolutely not. They put their foot down and said, she cannot practice here. And my friend is Black, and they were all white. And I was like, you guys, what? You've never said another midwife can't do births here. Like, they would pay the facility fee. Like, other midwives from other areas of the state would come in and do a birth here. She's licensed. How can you say that she cannot practice here? Like, what's going on? And I said, you guys are being racist. And they were like, how dare you say that? And that's what caused that final big thing where they kicked me out. And when I was kicked out, I was like, so relieved. I was like, I'm out, like, I got out of there. I don't have to deal with any of this anymore. It was such a relief. And, I guess they assumed that I would keep, just like, maybe I would do a home birth practice or something like that. But I just very quickly was just like, I'm done. I'm done. And then I went back to school to finish my undergrad degree. And I started thinking about my experiences, and that's when babies started dying at that birth center. 2013, they lost 3 babies. We had never lost one before. And I don't take credit for the fact that we hadn't lost any before, because I think that was just luck. But I can't help but wonder if when I left, it was like there was no watchdog at all over what they were doing anymore. So once those babies started dying, that's when I started to feel like really got some clarity about what was really going on, and that I had a responsibility to tell people what was going on at that birth center. You know, like I realized that this thing that I had helped create and that I had grown and I had nurtured and I had advertised and I had, you know, made successful, like I had a lot to do with that. And I realized that I was, you know, this thing that I had made had devastated these families forever. That's when I knew I had to start really coming out and sharing what was going on. And if that hadn't happened, I don't know if I ever would have felt that way, if I would have just let them go on their merry way and I would have done something else with my life. But it happened. And I'm just glad that I wasn't still part of that, because I don't know how I would have handled having such a direct responsibility. You know, at least I had that little tiny bit of separation where I had already left by the time this started happening. So I'm very grateful for that, for my own mental health. So.
Well, I was going to ask if you have any regrets, like looking back, you know, you went through school, you went through mentoring, you did all these things. Did you have any regrets looking back that you did midwifery and did all of this?
It's so hard. Because I know that, I mean, part of me is like, yeah, I regret the whole thing. I wish I never would have done any of it. I should have gotten an epidural with my first birth. I would be a totally different person, you know? So part of me feels that way. And part of me is like, if I hadn't done all that, I wouldn't have been able to share the information that I've been able to share. And I have talked to enough people to know that my work and my writing has been able to reach at least a few people out there and help them know what they were maybe going to get into and make a different choice for themselves. I don't know if my work has saved a single life or not. I hope it has. And it was worth it, even if it might have, you know? So I guess it's a complicated question, and the answer is yes and no. I kind of regret it all, and I kind of don't regret any of it.